You've been lied to about the Victorians, not a little, but a full industrial-strength cultural myth that's been repeated so many times, it's now become the truth. You probably believe the Victorians were prudes, buttoned up, passionless, horrified by the human body, too repressed to even look at a bare table leg without blushing. That's the story. It's a good story. It's also completely wrong. The Victorians weren't repressed. They were obsessed. They built the largest underground trade in explicit material the world had ever seen. They wrote manuals disguised as marriage advice that would make a modern reader blush. They even surveyed women about desire and pleasure decades before anyone else dared to ask. And they did all of it while publicly pretending that none of it existed. One entry on this list involves a secret survey of Victorian women that was so explosive it was buried for nearly a century. When it was finally found, it destroyed everything historians thought they knew about Victorian bedrooms. I'll tell you what it said, but not yet. Here are 10 intimacy secrets the Victorians tried very hard to keep hidden. Number 10. The wedding night was often a woman's first education. Here's something that sounds medieval, but was standard practice in middle-class Victorian England. A bride was expected to arrive at her wedding night knowing essentially nothing about the physical side of marriage. Not the mechanics, not the biology, not even a rough outline of what was about to happen. Dictionaries of the period sometimes omitted basic anatomical terms entirely. Advice manuals existed but were written in language so vague and euphemistic that a woman with no starting knowledge would have found them useless. One bride reportedly received a friend's written advice about bringing a special cloth to protect the bed linens, without any explanation of why she might need one. Meanwhile, her groom had almost certainly received his education elsewhere. By the late 1700s, over 10,000 women were working in London's oldest profession. The result was a grotesque asymmetry. One person in that bed had experience. The other had been deliberately kept in the dark, and the culture considered this arrangement not just acceptable, but virtuous. Number 9. Husbands had a legal right. Their wives could not refuse. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property, she couldn't sign contracts, she couldn't sue, and in the bedroom, she had no right to say no. The legal principle was explicit. Sir Matthew Hale, writing in the 17th century, declared that marriage constituted permanent, irrevocable consent, a contract that could never be withdrawn. That doctrine held for over 300 years. It wasn't until 1891 that a high court ruling in England even prevented a husband from physically confining his wife to enforce his marital privileges. And the full legal protection most people assume has always existed? That didn't arrive in England until 1991. Not a typo, 1991. For the average Victorian wife, the most private room in the house was the one where she had the fewest rights. Number 8. Fans, gloves, and handkerchiefs were a secret language of desire. Victorian courtship was surveilled from every angle. A chaperone was present at every meeting, every outing, every conversation. A woman couldn't be alone with a man until she was formally engaged. Even a prolonged handshake could damage her reputation. The only permitted physical contact during the entire courtship was a man offering his hand if the road was uneven. So, Victorian women invented a workaround. The fan, carried to every ball and social event, became an elaborate signaling system. Opening it wide meant she was interested. Closing it sharply meant she wasn't. Fanning quickly meant she was independent. Fanning with the right hand near the face meant the suitor should keep going. Opening and closing it repeatedly meant she wanted to be kissed. Swinging it meant she wanted to leave together. All of this was happening in plain sight, right in front of the chaperones, who either didn't understand the code or chose not to. Gloves worked too. Dropping one near a man was an invitation. Turning them inside out signaled dislike. Smoothing them meant she'd like to be closer. Young men, meanwhile, developed their own system through clandestine cards. Small cards passed discreetly during dances, often containing messages far more forward than anything either party would dare say out loud. An entire generation conducted its most intimate communication through accessories. Number 7. Women were advised to fake illness to avoid their husbands. Victorian marriage advice for women reads like a survival manual. One widely circulated piece of guidance instructed wives to give as little as possible, as rarely as possible, and above all, with as little enthusiasm as possible, warning that anything else could turn a proper marriage into something uncontrolled. Women were told to plead headaches, to fake illness, to insist on complete darkness so that nothing visual would encourage their husband. The underlying assumption was staggering, that women had no desire of their own, that their only function was to act as a restraining force, and that any sign of enthusiasm was not just unusual, but morally suspect. The advice wasn't fringe, it reflected the dominant medical and cultural consensus. Doctors and moralists of the period genuinely taught that female desire was either non-existent or a symptom of something wrong, and an entire generation of marriages was shaped by that lie. Number 6. There was a whole street in London dedicated to forbidden material. While polite society clutched its pearls over the word leg, there was an entire street in central London selling content that would be considered boundary-pushing in any era. Holywell Street, just off the Strand, was Victorian London's worst-kept secret, a narrow lane of lurching Tudor-era buildings where shopkeepers traded in everything from mildly suggestive prints to material that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 was supposed to destroy the trade. It didn't. It just pushed the industry underground and made the producers more inventive. One of the most prolific distributors, William Dugdale, operated under at least 4 fake names from multiple addresses. He was eventually caught and sentenced to hard labor. He died in prison, but the trade survived him. Photography, still a brand new technology, was immediately put to use. The earliest photographic material was hand-colored, startlingly detailed, and initially sold at luxury prices before cheaper versions flooded the market. The Daily Telegraph ran articles condemning the crowds who gathered outside Holywell Street's shop windows. The Victorian establishment waged war on this industry for decades. The industry won. Number 5. Queen Victoria herself was anything but restrained. The woman who gave the era its name was, by her own private account, extremely enthusiastic about her married life. Victoria married Prince Albert when she was 20, almost certainly without any prior experience, and by all surviving accounts, embraced the physical side of marriage wholeheartedly. In private letters to close friends, she described her passionate feelings for Albert in detail that would have scandalized the moral codes she supposedly embodied. Over the next 17 years, they had 9 children, despite Victoria openly despising pregnancy and childbirth. The motivation, clearly, was not reproduction. The woman whose name became shorthand for repression was, behind closed doors, one of the most demonstrably passionate figures of her age. Number 4. The secret survey that destroyed the myth. Here's the open loop. In 1892, a Stanford researcher named Clelia Mosher did something no one had done before. She began systematically surveying married women, real Victorian-era women, born as early as 1844, about their private lives. Not euphemistically, not in code, directly. She asked about desire, about frequency, about satisfaction, about what the experience meant to them. The results were explosive. Of 45 women surveyed, 35 said they actively wanted physical closeness with their husbands. 34 reported reaching the peak of the experience. 24 said that mutual enjoyment, not just having children, was the whole point. 3/4 were sharing a bed at least once a week. One woman, born in 1844, described it as a normal desire and said it kept people healthier. Another called it the highest devotion and said she was glad nature had given it to us. Mosher never published the data. She died in 1940, and the surveys sat undiscovered in the Stanford archives for over 30 years, until a historian named Carl Degler stumbled on them in 1973. His conclusion was devastating to the conventional narrative. The ideology of Victorian restraint, he wrote, was never actually put into practice. The most supposedly repressed generation in modern Western history was, in their own words, nothing of the sort. Number 3. Love letters were treated like physical contact. In a world where courtship was chaperoned, touching was forbidden, and even using a first name was considered scandalous, love letters became the primary vehicle for closeness, and the Victorians treated them accordingly. Letters were kissed. They were spritzed with perfume or scented paper to evoke the physical presence of the sender. They were worn under clothing. Women tucked them inside their stays, men carried them in breast pockets against their skin. They were read in bed, at night, in private, and the act of reading was understood by both parties to be an intimate experience. Couples described letters as substitutes for the closeness they were denied during courtship. They called them little chats on paper. They were opened carefully with letter openers to avoid damaging them, stored in private places, preserved for years. The destruction of a love letter, discarding it if the relationship failed, was treated with the emotional weight of ending a physical affair. In a culture that suppressed every other form of physical expression, paper became skin. Number 2. Forbidden books were disguised as household advice. The Victorian publishing industry developed an elegant workaround for the obscenity laws. Books with titles like Advice for the Maiden Wife and Mother or The Godly Marriage appeared on the shelves of respectable, literate women across the country. From the outside, they looked like domestic guidance. Inside, some contained detailed instructional content, illustrations, and what can only be described as practical advice that went far beyond what polite society would acknowledge. This allowed women to access material they were curious about without the social catastrophe of being caught with something forbidden. A woman found reading a marriage advice book was responsible. A woman found reading anything explicitly pleasurable was finished. The content could be identical. Only the cover mattered. Meanwhile, the underground literary scene was thriving. The Pearl, a magazine published from 1879 to 1880, was limited to 150 copies per issue and sold for the equivalent of a month's working-class wages. It contained serial fiction, satirical commentary on Parliament, and content that made absolutely no attempt to disguise itself. The Victorians didn't lack private literature. They just developed an elaborate system for pretending it didn't exist. Number 1. The Victorians invented the double life and made it a national art form. This is the real secret, not any single practice, but the system itself. Victorian intimacy wasn't absent, it was hidden, and the hiding was the point. The same society that criminalized explicit material produced more of it than any previous era in history. The same moral code that demanded female ignorance sat alongside a booming trade in paid companionship. An estimated 80,000 women were working in that trade in London alone by the 1890s. The same culture that treated the word leg as vulgar produced underground magazines that left nothing to suggestion. The same medical establishment that declared women incapable of desire was quietly being contradicted by the women themselves, in surveys that wouldn't see daylight for almost a century. The Victorians didn't suppress intimacy. They created a parallel world for it. One set of rules for public life, another for private. One set of books on the shelf, another hidden behind them. One version of marriage for the vicar, another behind closed doors. The hypocrisy wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system. And the most shocking part? We believed them. For over 100 years, we took the public performance at face value and assumed the private reality matched. It didn't. It never did. The Victorians were exactly as human as everyone who came before and after them. They were just better at pretending otherwise. If you think that's dark, you should see what happened when Victorian doctors got creative with their medical practices. That story's right here.